Perfect. All right. Okay. You know, the old joke that it's 100 miles from Minneapolis to St. Paul and 10 miles from St. Paul to Minneapolis. Well, it's the other way around today. It's the other way around today. So we are going to start, Mayor Fry and I thought it would be nice to talk about the new police chief and other things around public safety in Minneapolis, waiting for ultimately Mayor Carter to come and arrive. So, yeah, and then you're going to do so. Not yet, though. Wait till he comes. But why don't you tell us, Mayor Fry, about the new police chief and your public safety plan? And we might have to invite you back because I don't know if this time's going to be enough. So go for it.
Well, Rabbi Zimmerman, thank you so much for having me. Shana Tova, Gemar Tov. It is such an honor to be up here on the Bima and to speak to all of you about what is the priority right now in Minneapolis, which is safety. And of course, it's also an honor to welcome up Mayor Melvin Carter when he ultimately gets here. I'm sure they're stamping his passport as he rolls across the boundary right now, and we'll make sure to stamp it on his way back. But yes, as Rabbi Zimmerman said, we have a number of major changes right now in our city, none of which would have been possible without the question of the passage of question 1 just this last year. Are you all familiar with question 1 for the most part?
You know, Mayor, we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Why don't I explain it?
Why
to
don't
them?
you explain it? It just helps quickly, get us to that point.
So, for over 100 years in Minneapolis, we have had this very bizarre structure of government where basically nobody was in charge.
There you go. Sounds like Temple Israel. Joking. Joking.
And it was set up in a way where, on a very regular basis, through a crisis, I would invite into my office all of the major department heads, director of CPED, chief of police, city attorney, all into my office. We'd give directions because something needed to happen quickly. You do this, you do the other, you do that, go. You know, the first question that was always asked after I finished giving those directions is, what is the council going to do? We had a system that was set up so that a decision couldn't be made. It was problematic. It was disjointed, and it resulted in poor service to the city, especially during times of need. With the passage of question 1, we now have a clear executive in the mayor and a clear legislative body in the council. This is like what every other mid-size and major city has throughout the country, from St. Paul to Duluth to New York City to Chicago. It is often called a strong mayor system, and we did not have that up until very recently. Right now, we are creating this new government. And I cannot emphasize to you how important this is now. It is the most important thing I will ever do as an elected official, and it's the most important thing that has ever happened in our city in at least 50 years. The importance may not be that exciting, but it results in an efficiency and a level of service that is far superior to what we've got in the past. Here's what we're doing on safety. What we are doing on safety that was allowed by the passage of question 1 is a coordination of all of the services under one roof. So we brought in a commissioner of the Office of Community Safety in Commissioner Cedric Alexander, nationally renowned figure. And he is in charge of managing and coordinating between fire department, mental health services, police officers, 911, and emergency management, all under one roof. So violence prevention, doing things upstream before a crime takes place or a shooting takes place, in the same department as the downstream work in the law enforcement. You need all of it to make the system work practically. That is what we're setting up right now. And in setting that up, we need to have the best possible individuals in the right seats. So as I mentioned, we brought in the commissioner, Cedric Alexander, who is someone with a psychology background. He's obviously been a chief and a director of safety in a number of different cities. And we also brought in a person who is quite literally the rising star nationwide to become our next chief of the Minneapolis Police Department. His name is Brian O'Hara. He is a reformer and a progressive at heart. He is someone that has led the consent decree process in Newark, New Jersey. Did it so well, they made him chief. Did that so well, they made him the deputy mayor of the city. And he wants to come to our city because he recognizes the magnitude of this moment here in Minneapolis. He also recognizes that, we need to, yes, be firm, but also loving. We need to push with the left hand while bringing people in with the right, which is such a crucial part of making sure that you do safety well in any city. And something also that has been now possible through this new government structure is a broader recognition of how to provide service that is multifaceted. So safety, it's not just police officers or firefighters. Safety also is about having an affordable home where you can live, a stable place where you can go home to at the end of the night to rest your head on the pillow and to rejuvenate for the next day. It's about mental health response. We have a mental health epidemic right now throughout our city, and we've created a system where you can call 911 and get someone with mental health expertise responding to your call, matching a unique skill set with the unique service that we have on the ground. So we're building this city government out right now. My hope is that it will be in place within the next couple of months. And with that, we will have a structure that hopefully for generations and generations can serve our residents in a dramatically improved way.
Perfect. Oh, I don't need that. I have this. I forgot.
There you go.
So tell us a little bit about the bio. I mean, we could read it in the newspaper, but tell us about your experience working with this new chief and, coming into a complicated place, and with Rhonda's exit and now an interim, and with all that happened after the murder of George Floyd. So tell us what your conversations have been like. Give us a little bit of that part.
Well, so much has happened over the last couple of years, and one of the things that was also mentioned in the sermon is the importance of learning, is taking lessons and using those lessons to make you a better person, better mayor, a better doctor, a better practitioner of whatever it is that you happen to be working on. And our city is doing that in responding to the murder of George Floyd, the subsequent unrest, the safety crises we've had, the economic downturn. Now more than ever is such a great time to not just get back to the old normal, but to blow by that old normal to something truly transformational, which is what we are dead set on doing every single day. And in doing so, you need people that are also willing to sign up for that mentality, that have the courage to step in on some of the most difficult and controversial issues that we have. And I'll tell you, as mayor, as chief, especially in Minneapolis more than everywhere else right now, you're going to get beat up. Probably from both sides of the ideological spectrum, especially if you're doing it right. And so one of the first things that I asked in finding a new chief is, why specifically do you want to be here? Not why do you want to be chief, not why do you want to provide a multifaceted services of safety, but why do you want to be in Minneapolis at this particular moment? And he talked about a calling. He talked about all of the work that he has done throughout his career, adding up to this point in time right now where you can be the change and an example for other cities around the country to follow. He talked about this Office of Community Safety that we've set up and how it can set a trend nationwide for how you provide service to people that are in some of their worst moments of life. But most importantly, the things and the characteristics that this individual has were not characteristics that I thought up on my own. They came from the residents of this city. We had listening sessions in all 5 precincts in the city. We developed an online portal where you could submit any feedback or characteristics that you wanted to see. We got a volunteer search committee that helped bring in the best and the brightest people, then narrow down that search to the final 3, which they passed me, and then we conducted interviews. All 3 candidates, in fact, the top 6 or so were national caliber people. But it was very clear to me that this was a person that not only would inspire our city and the residents in it, not only has this deep experience at keeping people safe, but would also be able and willing to work with the police officers themselves. Now, you do need someone that's going to hold officers accountable. You also need someone that officers will listen to, that they feel that they will respect and that they will be guided by for the long haul. And I was very confident that people throughout our city, residents, would accept and embrace him as a progressive reformer of a chief. But the part that I was a little more concerned about is how will the cops embrace him? How will they work with him? How will they respect him so that he can create the change that he wants to see? And it's a funny story. About the second night in or so, he had been working all day long, doing engagement, council meetings, talking to council members, talking to the general public, doing press conferences. And in the evening, he said, "Hey, May, I really want to go out and see how things are on the street tonight."
Wow.
And I said, "Yeah, great.
Well,
why don't you do a roll call?" He said, yeah, I'll do the roll call, but I actually want to be on the street with an officer. Why don't I do a ride along? So after a roll call, and he went to roll calls in every single one of the precincts to listen, yes, to the public, but also to the officers themselves. What are they going through on a daily basis? And after that roll call, he went out on a ride along in the 3rd precinct, right around East Lake Street. And the officer that he was with noted that there was some odd activity that was happening out of the corner of his eye, and they saw a gun. Somebody raised a gun, and there was clearly something afoot. Well, on his very first night here, he got in a foot chase, ran after the person that had the gun, could have been shot easily. They managed to de-escalate a tense situation, got the guy to drop the gun, tackled him, handcuffed him, arrested him, and with no major issue, the perpetrator of the crime, of the alleged crime, has now been taken off the street. And I'll tell you, the next morning he walked into a roll call in the precinct, and every single one of the officers wanted to follow. They wanted this person to lead. They wanted him to lead us through reform, culture change, every bit of it. And so if there's some hope, I'll tell you, it's here. And it's not just in him, because I'll tell you, even with him as the chief of police,
finish your sentence. It's okay.
There will be struggles. Something at some point will happen that is bad. But my ask to all of you is to stand with him, is to stand with all of us, is to, as Rabbi Moss said not too long ago, recognize not just the past and what has been, but the potential of what we could be.
Perfect. All right, Mayor Carter. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Zimmerman. I don't know if we've ever met before, but it's so lovely. Great. Well, Mayor Fry's going to introduce you, actually. But no, it's good. It's good. Yeah, you sit there. Well, yeah. So your introduction.
Well, Mayor Carter, good morning. Good afternoon at this point. Mayor Carter and I get to hang out probably 2 to 3 days a week during other things. And so it's such an honor to have you in Temple Israel, my temple, Rabbi Zimmerman's temple, the sanctuary of all of these extraordinary people, our wonderful congregation, and another individual that you might know very personally in the audience.
At least one.
At least one. At least one. But for all of you, Mayor Carter is a good friend. He's a colleague. He's someone that I go to for advice and partnership and input. For quite a while there, it kind of lagged a little during COVID-19. We were getting together on at least a monthly basis to go for a run, and it was as much of a psychological session for both of us as it was a policy rundown. Right now, being a mayor is a heavy job. All the toughest issues that the federal and state governments don't want to touch ultimately get passed to mayors. And oftentimes we don't have the resources or sometimes the authority or power to deal with them in full. But for those of you that don't know Mayor Carter, the work that he's doing in St. Paul is incredible. Everything from the reconnection of an extraordinary and historically black neighborhood in Rondo, which is, I think, something that every city in the country should be doing because every city in the country has that same dynamic, to the work he's doing around climate change, to affordable housing, which is something that we partner on so consistently. Mayor Carter, it's a great honor to have you here in Temple, Israel. Rabbi Zimmerman, thank you so much for inviting him on this Yom Kippur. Shana Tova, Happy New Year. We're proud to have you. Mayor Carter, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Give him a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you.
So we're just going to have a conversation, and we're going to jump off at the Reconnect Rondo because we, as a congregation, many of us went to Reconnect Rondo. Somebody asked, how did you get the mayor to come from St. Paul? And then they thought for a minute, and the mayor from Minneapolis to introduce the mayor from St. Paul, and they thought for a minute, she's married to Frank Hornstein. That's why. But that isn't why, actually. But we do love Frank. But we just... He does come up with the ideas. So we all got to hear, after Frank went on a tour, he said, you've got to bring Temple Israel to a tour of Reconnect Rondo. And it was right before the money came through. And so tell us about this incredible project. It was inspiring to be at their gathering community center.
Well, one, thank you so much for the invitation here. I'm honored to share this space on such a sacred day with you. Two, Mayor Fry mentioned our runs together being psychological and also policy. For me, it was actually a workout too. But he's a former professional marathoner, so I couldn't get him to break a sweat. And certainly have to say good morning, good afternoon, good afternoon to my father, Melvin Carter Jr. It's good to see you here.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Who's very relevant to the topic because my father grew up in the Rondo neighborhood. And Rondo, for those of you who don't know, although I imagine most of you do know, was the thriving, historically African-American neighborhood that was uprooted to build the freeway. In today's dollars, it's estimated over $157 million of wealth was stripped from our African-American community by virtue of the land that was taken. And this is a previous, Mayor Fry and I spend a lot of time in environmental impact statements and things like that are federal law these days, as does Representative Hornstein. But this is prior to all of that law. And so my grandparents lost over half a dozen properties that they owned on Rondo when the freeway came through. And the important thing to know about this too, as Mayor Fry mentioned, this is a story that played out, not just in, this is a story that's by no means unique to St. Paul. This is a story that played out around the country. And if the St. Paul number is $157 million, when we start to think of what the national number is, if you add in Detroit and add in Oakland and add in Chicago and add in all these larger cities around the country, it becomes pretty staggering. And so our goal is to build a land bridge over a particular portion of that. My elders in the African American community always used to say, the one thing, if you get some hand on some land, don't let go of it, because that's the one thing they're not making any more of. Our goal is to make some more land, because we know that land and wealth are inextricably tied. Our goal is to help ensure that descendants of the old Rondo neighborhood can rebuild the family wealth, the family inheritances that were stripped. And so one proposal that I have in front of the city council right now is for the city to sponsor up to $100,000 in fully forgivable financing to help low-income descendants of old Rondo families buy a home in our community.
Wow. It's amazing, amazing. And who are some of your partners in that project?
We've got a lot of partners. One of the things I meant to mention, though, too, is one of the core organizations in the Rondo neighborhood that's been an organization in the Rondo neighborhood for a very long time is an organization called Hallie Q. Brown. I was at Hallie Q. Brown last week for their annual celebration, and they host archives. They've hired an archivist and host archives, and they have all these archives of the African American community in St. Paul, the history of the African American community in St. Paul. Incidentally, one other thing I need to say is, as we build freeways that plow over people's homes, as we are in a post-George Floyd world in our community around the conversation around sworn members of law enforcement who very clearly, very wrongfully took the life of an unarmed man as he pleaded for his mother. It also strikes me, as I remember the stories that my father told me growing up, of seeing the St. Paul Fire Department burn down his parents' house as a training exercise after they were removed from the home. And it's all these different ways, and I firmly believe that the protest movement that we saw launch globally from Minneapolis wasn't just about police brutality, but it was about all the ways in which people see all these different systems that we pay into, that we're promised are going to help us raise our children, feel like they sort of have a knee on our neck. I was saying all of that to say, I've gotten a chance to sort of peruse the archives, and one of the things that was really incredible to me is the amount of times a group of Jewish women come up who were in close partnership with our African American community, who were landowners in the Rondo neighborhood, who we're doing this thing called Just Deeds to remove racist covenants from deeds. And there's evidence that those Jewish neighbors not only were aware of those things, but took intentional efforts to make sure that when they sold their properties, and the properties that they were able to buy and sell did not have those types of racist deeds on them. So historically, and this is one of the reasons I'm here today, historically, the Jewish community and the African American community in St. Paul have been very, very close partners. And that's something that we don't always remember or reflect on or practice moving into the future. But I think it's important to note. We have a great organization called the Rondo Community Land Trust, who's a good partner of ours. We have a great organization called Reconnect Rondo that you just mentioned. And all of this partnership excites me most because growing up, for me, Rondo was a story about what once was, about what we lament having lost. And all of a sudden, the name Rondo has transitioned in our community in St. Paul from a lament of the past, a lamentation of the past, to an excitement about what the future can hold.
It's great. It's great. And it's It's so exciting. We went to the gathering space. Is it Reconnect? Is that the Reconnect Rondo group who put
Yes.
that together? And just heard the story, and then walked the bridge that, or at least the end of it, so that is going to be, and it's very exciting. It's very exciting.
We're really excited about the opportunity. The land bridge is something of a moonshot for us that we know will take a lot of energy, a lot of money, and a lot of time to put together. But I think it's really worth it. And I agree that it's something that we ought to think about nationwide, between the land bridge conversation, that what I call the inheritance fund, that's a housing subsidy that I just described. We think we are in many ways building a model for the nation as we think about atonement. You can't have, one of the things that we shared is you can't, if I stole $100 from you, just saying sorry would probably not be enough to atone for that. And, for a lot of these things, we have made public apologies. We've issued public apologies for 20 years for some of these things. To families who lost their whole family inheritance because of public policy decisions. I'm sure it sounds good to hear a public apology, but it does not replace those inheritances. It does not replace the family wealth that was stripped in order to make an authentic atonement. We believe it requires resource.
Right, it's reconciliation, right?
That's right.
So I think, so often the Jewish community understands us because we've had covenants against being able to live in certain neighborhoods and certain, hospitals. We weren't able to practice in the hospitals, so we created our own institutions. And also, through the Holocaust, there has been a similar kind of move to not just say they're sorry, but to have these kinds of reconciliations that are meaningful and powerful and add money. I used to take a congregant every year to make sure she was alive so she could receive money from Germany because she was in Auschwitz, and so we had to determine that she was alive. So those are the kinds of things that we have that experience in order to understand and fight for and work for those kinds of things. So I think that is so essential. And we have so much to do in this country, as one of my colleagues and ministers turned to me and said, but Rabbi, you left your Egypt. We're still living in ours. And I think that was such a whoa. That is a powerful moment. So I think that. So there's so many issues and so many, how to be an elected official or part of any institution, in all honesty, in the 21st century when there's no faith anymore from an array of places for an array of different reasons. How do you lead? How do you fill your position as an elected official in a time of great mistrust? And what do you see as moving forward? I'm just asking you so you can help me, okay? Is that
right?
Good. You've got the answers.
The shortest answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
And I don't know that anybody does. One thing, Mayor Fry mentioned, we share backgrounds as runners. And I always share with folks, I learned about leadership running track. And, so much of Twitter and so much of the current culture tells us that a leader is someone who's separate from us. A leader is someone who, has the most polished shoes and gives the, most speeches and those types of things. For the better part of both of our lives, the leader was the one with the muddiest shoes. The leader was the one who was the sweatiest, probably the stinkiest. and on the track, a leader is just defined as someone who is doing the work. I remember we had a teammate who, would show up at practice with the real nice clothes and the pretty clothes and the pretty shoes and stuff like that. And we would always laugh and go, you can't run where we're about to run. You can't take the journey. You can't be a leader because you can't take that journey. So our goal in St. Paul is to launch a grand experiment in participatory governance. What would it look like if we took this concept? The Declaration of Independence says governments are instituted deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. As we think about the Me Too movement that we saw in the last decade, we've defined consent not as sort of silent acquiescence, but as a real empowered, energized, informed agreement. And if we really take that seriously and go down that road, I think it opens a whole door for government that we don't have access to otherwise. When I got elected, we launched what we call our community hiring panels. Every member of my cabinet has been named through a community process that we created. In the first 100 days of my administration, we completely revised and rewrote the use of force policies that govern our police department through a two-way dialogue with community members over a course of 2 months. Every budget that we've brought forward, every major policy that we bring forward, we do through a pretty intense and engaged community engagement process. And one of the intriguing things, so that's, I think the most core thing is to lead by following, to lead by listening, to lead by engaging people and allow their voice to be heard. It's a model of leadership, frankly, that I learned from my father growing up. What we're learning, which is really incredible, I ran for re-election last year, and I heard this in a new way. We've raised the minimum wage. We have launched college savings accounts. We start every child born in St. Paul with $50 in a college savings account. And my favorite thing to tell new moms is, look, if you have a baby in St. Paul and you don't want your child to have a college savings account, there's paperwork to fill out. And that's true. You have to apply to not have a college savings account for your child in St. Paul. We're both piloting guaranteed income pilots in both of our cities. We're about to launch the fourth such pilot in St. Paul. We've pushed a lot, and we've eliminated late fines in our libraries. We just eliminated participation fees for youth sports, and right now we have 1,000 more kids in youth sports than we did just this time last year. We're excited about the ways in which our community is responding to these types of policies. The tie that binds them all together is this. What I've realized is the model of city building that we inherited tells us that if we want to keep our neighborhoods safe, we got to lock up all the black and brown boys we can find. It tells us that if we want to get around our neighborhood, we got to plow roads over people's homes, and that if we want our cities to succeed economically, we got to break the piggy banks to find some business in Memphis, Miami, or better yet, Minneapolis, to get them to move from that other city to our community while people are struggling right up under our noses. And I think what people are really angry about, and I think what people are really sick of, is a model of city building that causes us always to bet against our own constituents, to always bet against ourselves, to always bet against the prosperity and opportunity, to only recognize problems internally and to only look for promise externally. And what I think we're finding when we bring people into the conversation, they see the potential in their neighborhoods, they see the potential in their families and their children and their businesses and their ideas. So my hope is what we're doing in St. Paul is sort of reversing the polarity of that traditional model of city building to say, our job is every day to find some bold, aggressive, and maybe even offensively aggressive way to bet on ourselves, to bet on our children, to bet on our families, to bet on our businesses, to bet on our workforce, and see where that gets us as a city.
Thank you.
Just for the record, she said groovy after I finished saying that. I don't know that. That's a compliment.
But don't talk about nice shoes because
those are amazing.
Yeah. So what should we be thinking about? I think so often people, well, let me just say, like at Temple is, we should do this and we should do that. It's like, yeah, but sort of seeing the whole. What should we be aware of as people who live in the city, who care about the city, and and who want to make things better, but we don't see what you see. We don't have the view of the whole in the same way. We open the newspaper, that doesn't give you everything, right? We know that. The press kind of has to put a certain spin on something and then they're done with it. And if you don't get it in on time, then they're not going to talk to you about it. I'm not downing the press, but I'm just saying, opening the newspaper, we're learning, is not all the way we can get the news. So what is the news that we should know?
Well, it's a good question. And, as I look around this room, I see so many just heroes of mine, people who, this is an incredible room of people. And the collective influence of all of us in this room is really enormous. Frankly, more so than our influence in isolation. I always tell folks, as the mayor, I've learned I have the power to make people do everything I can convince them to pretty please want to do anyways. And I was having a conversation with a group of older white men recently, and we were talking about police community relations. And I was just sharing with them some of my experiences growing up. When we finished the conversation, they said, "Boy, it's so good to hear you say this." They're telling me, "You need to be talking about this stuff. Your voice needs to be heard more."
Yeah.
They said, "Not us, but your voice needs to be heard." And I ended up telling them, all my friends already know. And I was trying to share, it's in many ways more powerful for you to say this stuff than it is for me to say this stuff. And I shared with them, here's my perspective around that is, I ended up telling them, listen, if you think the world needs to be a more equitable and just place for me and my children, then yes, you should probably sit on the sideline. If you look and see the disparities that exist in our community and cannot sit still and understand the way in which that hurts you and your family and your children and your businesses, then you have every right to a seat at this table that I do. And I think that's something that's important for people to know. We talk about equity all the time, and this is something I'm really excited about right now. We talk about equity all the time, but we get lost sometimes in our conversation about equity because we don't really know what it is. We don't really know what we mean. We know what it's not. And we know when we can point to something and say, that's not equity, and it makes us mad. But we don't have a common definition of what we're striving for. And that's something that's really important. I went to business school for my undergraduate degree. And my business school dean, when she said equity, she was talking about money. Mm-hmm. When my business school dean talked about equity, she was talking about shares of ownership, particularly of appreciable, transferable assets. She was talking about decision-making power, and she was talking about participation in the economy. If I own equity in a company, and that company has a good quarter, then I have a good quarter too. So I've sort of shed the social justice definitions of equity in favor of the economic business school definitions of equity. And my challenge for everybody who knows that our organization or our synagogue or our government unit or our business or whatever it is, we want to figure out how we can do better by those people or by that community, is to think about equity. And from my perspective, if we switch, and again, this is what's driving what we're trying to do in St. Paul, if we switch from how do we help those people, which is always going to be somewhat amorphous, to how do we ensure that every member of our community has a role in the decision-making processes that we use particularly to govern our resources. How do we expand the group of people in our community who have assets, who have appreciable, transferable assets? And how do we ensure that as our city skyline grow and our macro economy grows, it's a little easier for somebody to pay the rent. That's what equity sounds like for me. And so for all of our own organizations, for the businesses, for the government units that you all run, that's my challenge to us. That's what I think we need to know, is the way we make the world better is by expanding that universe of folks who can make those decisions alongside us.
Great. So it's the Paul Wellstone, when we all do better, we all do better.
Well, it is. I think it's a little more than that,
Okay,
honestly.
good.
Because we have an ocean of positive intent in Minnesota. And that's a good start. It clearly hasn't gotten us there. And I think what I'm saying, as I talk to university leaders or business leaders who say, hey, how do we, get into the African American community better? How do we serve Lord? My question is, well, who's on your board? My question is, who are your decision-making partners? What's your business case for engaging the African American community better? And so, yes, we all do better when we all do better. I find, Paul Wellstone told us that. Martin Luther King told us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But we don't really even need the prophets. Like, we've lived over the last 2 years, and we just know really fundamentally that if somebody's homeless, that if somebody can't go to the doctor when they have symptoms, that if somebody can't shelter in place when Dr. Fauci says shelter in place, that if somebody can't take a week off of work to care for a sick child, that we're all less safe. That I'm less safe too, that you're less safe.
Yeah.
And even as I did the reading, I did the reading for today.
Wow.
In Isaiah, one of the things that I read loud and clear is that our salvation is dependent upon each other's salvation.
That's right.
And that's, I think, the key there is, our guaranteed income work is about self-sufficiency. It's about giving people the keys to make the decisions on their own and entrusting them. I believe people don't trust government because of all the ways every day government tells them we don't trust you. If we say, here's some money, but you can only use it for childcare, you can only use this for healthcare, you can only use this for food, what we're saying is, absent the parameters that I'm putting on you, I don't trust you to spend this money in ways that will benefit your child.
That's right.
And so when we say, look, here's $500 a month, unconditional cash transfer, raise your children, do what your family needs, that recognizes the way our economy works. Every family doesn't need the same thing the same way at the same time. Some families might need childcare supports. Some families might need healthcare supports. The family that needs clothing this month might have a truck breakdown next month. And I think that's the core of restoring the trust. I fundamentally believe that if we're going to restore democracy, it's going to happen in City Hall, not Washington, D.C. And I think the core of restoring trust is by going first to break the cycles of distrust.
Great. Just a little advertisement. There's going to be cards and pens, paper, actually little pencils, not pens, but to write down questions, and Rabbi Klein will be gathering them and telling us the questions that are coming from.
Does he have to talk to or just me?
Just you. Okay. He will eventually. He will eventually.
I'm just kidding.
Eventually. Yeah. No. So climate change seems to be a thing from what I just heard from Mayor Fries. So tell us what is at the core of that, what's happening in St. Paul around that. Frank and I went to McAllister, so we always love St. Paul. Always love St. Paul. Lots of St. Paulites here too, who live presently in St. Paul, who are members of Temple Israel, but also who grew up there. So tell us what's happening in St. Paul around climate change and where your passion comes from.
Absolutely. It's a real relatively new journey for me. We hired Russ Stark, who I served with on the city council as our city's chief resilience officer. A long time ago, Russ and I got elected to the city council at the same time, and he was sort of the champion of the environment on the city council for years. And I would tell Russ, I can't afford to be an environmentalist. I thought of an environmentalist as somebody who could afford hemp clothes and organic food and, hybrid vehicles and all this type of stuff. Yeah. This is just not for me. I can't afford it. And I also tell him, I don't like that there's a hole in the ozone layer. And I don't have a problem with the manatees. But we got this real suffering right in our community, right in front of our face that I just have to prioritize higher. Mm-hmm. You dig further in. and you start to realize all the ways in which, one, our climate is already changing. We talk about climate change as though it's something that's maybe going to happen in the future. Meanwhile, here, and I go speak in DC or, you know, on the coast, and people go, what are you doing talking about climate change? You're not a coastal mayor. What we know is that our winters are more extreme than they ever were when I was growing up. That in the last 10 years, we've experienced the highest levels of precipitation and the highest levels of drought on record in our city's history. We know that last year we uttered words that none of us had in our vocabulary before that. Air quality alert just didn't seem like a Minnesota thing to me until last year. I know that my first year as mayor, it was the last Saturday in April that we saw about 400,000 pounds of rock fall from the bluff onto Wabasha Avenue in St. Paul. I'll always remember that was the last Saturday in April, because if it had been the first Saturday in May, it would have fallen on our annual Cinco de Mayo parade and would have been a global story. So we know what our streets look like. We don't necessarily realize that what's happening with our streets is, when I was a kid, it froze in November or October and thawed somewhere around May or June or something like that. And this year it freezes and thaws in October, and it freezes and thaws in November, and it freezes and thaws in December. And our streets look the exact same way our ice tray would look in our refrigerator if we plugged in, and if we just went all winter plugging in our freezer and unplugging our freezer. And so we see all these impacts, but we don't necessarily connect it to climate crisis. As we talked about Rondo, I know that my 16-year-old daughter has chronic asthma, but I don't necessarily connect it to the fact that we live right in between University Avenue and I-94 and Snelling Avenue, the most heavily car trafficked part of our town. So we realize that when the climate crisis is here, every week it seems there's some study that goes, oh, it's bigger than we thought, and it's, you know, closer than we thought. And we're also realizing the extent to which it impacts low-income communities, Black and brown families, families of color, neighborhoods of color first, the most. And so we're doing a lot. Boy, I gave all that answer on climate crisis and still haven't told you what we're doing about it. We're doing lots. Buildings and transportation in a city like St. Paul and Minneapolis. The majority of our emissions are going to come from buildings and transportation. So those are the two centerpieces of what we're doing. We launched a game called, I can't remember the name of the game because I always call it Biggest Loser for Buildings. If you know the TV show Biggest Loser. It's that for buildings and for building emissions. We challenge our building. It's Energize St. Paul. There you go. We challenge building owners in St. Paul to reduce the emissions of their buildings. Our building owners love it because it's just savings for them. We launched a $5 million internal loan fund. We're switching out, LED light bulbs and HVAC systems in city-owned buildings, which is fantastic for us because the investments that we're making have, generally speaking, a 5 to 7 year break-even ratio, after which it's just permanent savings for St. Paul residents. We were excited recently. We just launched together the nation's first car share program powered entirely by electric vehicles, powered entirely by renewable energy. So I love telling folks that they own an electric vehicle. If you live in St. Paul or Minneapolis, you own an electric vehicle because the vehicles are owned by the cities. And so, we're going all in to try to address this. We obviously need other cities to do so. We need our federal government. We need other countries to do so. But it turns out if 400 mayors across the country say a thing like America is going to meet our agreements under the Paris Accord, it sort of holds some weight.
Yep. So, Temple Israel has a commitment as well, and we are improving a piece of land that we have on Lake Minnetonka that we've had. We bought a piece of land from the Boy Scouts and have had a Jewish day camp, about 45 minutes away from here. And we have a new project that is totally carbon neutral and actually is renewable energy. So it's an amazing project. So we'll invite you out there.
I didn't know that, but
we'll
that's exciting.
Both
I'd love
of
to
you
see
out
that.
there to see this incredible place. We're just beginning that project, which will be done in about a year. It looks like Rabbi Klein might have a question.
Seems like everyone has lots of questions. Thanks for being here, both mayors. I'm going to step here so that the folks at home can see and hear me better ask questions, as we have some coming through on Zoom and some coming through in the room. What an honor to have you both here. The first set of questions from Mayor Carter focus on the economy. So I think one framework is with a mixed or weakening economy, how can some of these new initiatives be sustained? We have one person in particular who'd be interested to hear more about the impact of the universal income initiative, and perhaps if you could reflect on some of the implications of how this might affect St. Paul City's, the impact on St. Paul City with federal poverty guidelines. That would be helpful as well.
Thank you very much. We're building a theory. So again, it's the shortest answer is I don't know. There's a lot of things that we're doing and we're shifting, we're changing. That the truth is, people always ask me, how do you know this is going to work? And my response to them is always, what I know for a fact is what we'll get if we keep doing these things the same way we've always done them. And so I don't necessarily know that these things are going to work, but I know that getting it right is more important than being right. And I know that our goal is to shift the way that we approach some of these challenges. Yes, the economy is shifting on us, and the truth is that impacts some of us. But there are too many families in St. Paul and Minneapolis for whom the economy is some, frankly, irrelevant creature, because they don't have a 401k to watch tank. They're not participating in banking in the way that we do to be impacted when interest rates change. And this goes back to our definition of the economy ends up being what the Dow Jones line is doing, or what the indexes are doing when those indexes find themselves stunningly divorced from the quality of life that people in too many of our neighborhoods lead. In 2020, for example, we saw more people homeless. In St. Paul, we experienced in just a matter of weeks a 10-fold increase in the number of our residents who are sheltering outdoors. We saw more people unemployed. I believe it was something like 80,000 claims for unemployment insurance in our city of just over 300,000 people. That's total population, 300,000 people. That includes my 2-year-old. That's not working age population. So 80,000 unemployment claims in 1 year is staggering. We saw families stockpiling toilet paper and just in deep despair and financial trouble. And we saw at the same time record stock market returns, and we saw record increases in CEO pay right here in Minnesota. And so, that's the sort of divorced nature that our definition of equity does not allow for. And so that's why these investments directly in families are really important. Our guaranteed income pilot that the person asked about, we alluded to it earlier before. We're providing to a cohort of low-income families with very young children monthly payment of $500 a month to help them get to the end of the month for a period of 2 years. We're doing it we did our first round out of CARES Act dollars. We're doing our next round out of American Rescue Plan dollars. I sure wish it was something that I could sustain permanently and at scale. It's not. So in the meantime, what we're doing in coalition, I'm a co-chair of this national organization called Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. We just celebrated in Atlanta last week our 100th mayor signing on to this coalition. We are operating just under 50 mayor-run pilots and about 100 pilots of this around the country, including the pilot in Minneapolis. And we launched a Center for Guaranteed Income Research out of Pennsylvania, which is helping us kind of do the research around this. The biggest knocks on this, people always say, how are you going to get people to work? Why should people work if you're giving away free money? I promise you one thing, you will never hear somebody say that who could quit their job for $500 a month. But that said, one of the things that we're finding is that as we do this research, the participants in the experimental group, the people who get the $500 a month, are actually gaining employment at rates significantly higher than people who don't, which is a surprise until you start asking them why, and they say some really obvious things. I could put my child in childcare and look for a job. I took time off of my part-time job to interview for a full-time job, and those types of things. So it becomes obvious. The other piece is that I think has been one of the most critical critiques of this work is the question, how are you going to keep participants from getting kicked off of their state and their federal assistance programs? Which is an important point, because we don't want people to get kicked off of their state and federal assistance programs. But the question itself is an acknowledgement that our state and federal eligibility criteria block families from upward financial mobility. It's insane. And it's not that big of a deal when half a dozen families say no thanks to St. Paul's guaranteed income trial. But we have to know that they are representing thousands of families, millions of families across the country who have to say no thanks to a promotion, who have to say no thanks to more hours at work, who have to say no thanks to a raise because they're worried they're going to get kicked off of their food supports or their child care supports. That is the definition of structural inequity. That is the definition of our policy decisions keeping people stuck in cycles of poverty. It's important to me because when my oldest daughter was born, we were on WIC. And if anybody knows about WIC, it's nutritional supports for women, infants, and children. And if you know anything about WIC, you can go in a grocery store, and they've made a lot of changes to the program since then. But you can go in a grocery store and you can walk out with literally more eggs, more cheese, more milk, and more peanut butter than you can possibly figure out what to do with in the next week. The problem is my daughter was born with severe allergies to eggs, dairy, and peanuts. And so we could walk through this grocery store and get all the cow's milk in the world, none of the soy milk she could actually drink. We could walk through the grocery store and get enough eggs for an egg fight at homecoming, but nothing that she could actually eat. We could walk through the grocery store. She has a severe life-threatening allergy to peanuts, and we could get all the peanut butter we needed, but no almond butter that she could actually consume. That's what happens. That's the damage. That's the violence that we inflict when we tell people we know what your family needs from City Hall or for the state capitol or from Washington, D.C. better than you do. And so that's why this approach is exciting for me. And long story short, the goal around this economy is to do something we've never actually done. And that's think about how we weather a storm, an economic storm, by literally betting as hard as we can on low-income families and frontline workers. Boy, watch how short my next answer is going to be.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing your personal story. Mayor Carter, you mentioned earlier the historical relationship between the Black and the Jewish community. And today we recognize more and more how many people are members of both and each together. But thinking community by community, what can the Jewish community do today with the Black community to be more supportive, to restore perhaps some of that historic partnership that you described? What can we as Jews in the room, some of us who experience a lot of us who experience a great deal of white privilege, and a lot of us who don't, do to step up?
There's a woman I know who we were having a conversation after Philando Castile was killed. And she was telling me, she's an older white woman, and she was telling me she just couldn't understand. So if the police officers ask me for my driver's license, I just give it to them. Well, that makes sense. So why wouldn't somebody, she just couldn't understand this movement that we were talking about. And she said, well, what does he have to hide? If you don't have anything to hide, just, and I told her, I believe you would. If a police officer asks you for your driver's license, just show it to him. If it happened a second time, and then a third time, and then a 16th time, and then a 53rd time, at some point in time, you'd look up and wonder why you keep having to prove that you're just sitting there peacefully acknowledging all known laws. And you'd probably get frustrated. At one point in time, she was telling me about her family and her family history, and how her family fled to the United States from Poland. And she explained to me that when the secret police came around, her grandfather would hide his daughters, her mom and her aunt, in the barn. And I asked her, well, what did he have to hide? And she said, well, you don't understand. When the secret police would come around, X, Y, and Z atrocities. And I ended up saying, no, I fully understand. And I think he would have been insane not to hide his daughters in the barn when those secret police came around. It just is stunning to me that you see no relationship between the two conversations. And she looked and said, no, it's completely different. Before the pandemic, I used to say that I think the secret to a lot of the problems that we solve is everybody just getting together in the same space sometimes and breathing the same oxygen. The pandemic made me have to find a different metaphor. But just figuring out that you're a person the same as I'm a person. And just spending the time necessary to look in each other's eyes, to hear each other's stories. I heard somebody say recently, an enemy is someone whose story you haven't yet heard. And I think there's a significant amount of power when we realize how closely connected we are. We'll never get beyond the name George Floyd in Minnesota, in our country, maybe on the planet. Without acknowledging and understanding, I mean, one of the things that I think was most poignant to me in that moment, as I talked to the most staunchest Blue Lives Matter police activists I can find, what I hear them say is, don't rush to judgment. Don't be judge, jury, and executioner. He gets to have his day in court. X, Y, and Z. And all the things they describe are all the same things that I just wish we had extended to George Floyd. And at some level, my answer to this question might just disappoint all of you, because I really believe it's as simple as being in spaces with one another. That it at least starts as simple as just being in spaces with one another, as putting down the other instinct. We all think we're in a grand battle in which we are righteously fighting back against they who are attacking us. But the truth is, the one thing they know without a doubt is whoever we are and whoever they is that they're in a grand battle who are righteously fighting back against us who are attacking them. And just the opportunity to be in the same space, to understand each other, to breathe the same oxygen, or whatever new metaphor I come up with, and to figure out how to get ourselves on the same side of the table, I think is a real good jumping off point for whatever else we do from there.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We have about 10 more minutes. And we also have some questions kind of for both of you around partnership, around learning from each other. So
Perfect.
I thought maybe I would put these kind of 4 out there, and you could answer what you want to answer. And
you can hand the microphone over to.
I was going to do that.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great.
So 2 of the questions are about moving around. One of them is, what kinds of thoughts or plans are there in the works to make the Twin Cities more walkable? And complementary with that is how are the Twin Cities learning from the collaborations and the innovations that have been happening around groundwork on public transportation, which has been so excellent in so many ways. And is some of what we've learned there going to move us toward other kinds of collaboration between the cities? And then the other questions are, I think, about other kinds of learning. So first of all, can you reflect a little bit more on the public schools, and is there anything that Minneapolis can learn from St. Paul about resolving teacher contract negotiations, just as we think about moving forward to our situations for our teachers in our schools, and also what about the language around police reform? Did the language around defunding fall flat in Minneapolis? are we at a time where we're ready to kind of quote unquote move on from that? Is there a new framework that we should think about in St. Paul, sort of knowing where the referendums ended up? And I don't envy either of you for having 8 questions to tackle and 8 minutes to tackle as many of those as you'd like.
One, in the pandemic, I just saw an article that said this, Washington Post article that says, in the pandemic, the federal government released 11,000, have anybody seen this article? Released 11,000 people from federal prisons. Guess how many have committed a violent crime? Of the 11,000 people released from federal prisons in the pandemic, 1 has released, there have been 16 like minor offenses as well. But that's a incredibly, remarkably low number. And I think it proves that we can do something completely different where public safety is concerned. We're wasting a lot of lives and a whole lot of money just keeping people locked up. My approach to this, my father's a retired St. Paul police officer, 28 years. My approach to public safety really is, I think the work of our police officers is sacred, is critical, and is important work. That is an important part of a comprehensive public safety system. And I also believe that if I talk to any of you about my plan to keep your children safe, and I told them it amounted to racing somebody to the scene as quickly as possible after something terrible happened to them, that probably wouldn't be sufficient. So that's why we need a more universal approach. That's why we need an approach that includes not just crime response, which by definition is after the fact, but the type of proactive investments we're both calling for in places and in people to help us reduce the likelihood that something terrible will happen in the first place. Want to take the next one? That was quick, wasn't it?
That was, yeah.
So there's about 5 or 6 questions all in one. First, I'll say this. Something that the two of us subscribe to is a philosophy that good mayors copy and great mayors steal. Absolutely. From each other.
Absolutely.
A good idea in Minneapolis could become an extraordinary one in St. Paul and vice versa. And I cannot tell you how many times we have taken ideas from one another and then implemented those ideas. We both have a guaranteed basic income pilot. Similarly, the program that I'm probably most proud of that we've been able to implement is called Stable Homes, Stable Schools. While the city doesn't control the school system, I think that's kind of a cop-out. You always hear mayors say, well, we don't control the school system and that's not us. And technically that is true. There's a school board. But practically speaking, there is no subject matter that has a greater impact on the future than our kids, our children. And we've seen that around 8.5% of our Minneapolis public school age children were past tense experiencing homelessness. And so we stepped up with a program called Stable Homes, Stable Schools that took the simple philosophy of say, let's just give them a home. Hopefully a home within a certain radius of the school where they're going. We created a partnership with public housing, with a number of different nonprofits, with the city of Minneapolis. And today, just a couple of years later, we have prevented almost 4,000 kids from experiencing homelessness. 4,000. And oftentimes when you do something, you recognize when you give someone a home that they're less likely to experience homelessness. But there were other things that started happening. Their grades got better. Now, granted, it's been a little bit harder to track during a global pandemic, but the grades didn't just get better. They were less likely to move from school to school. There was amazing turnover that these classrooms were seeing because they were destabilized by the fact that these kids would start in one school, there was housing instability at home, and they had to move to another. That wasn't good for the kid. It wasn't good for the classroom either, or the teacher. And so, whereas our impact on teachers' union conversations is meager at times, we can speak out and we can say something and we can try to facilitate something, like a conversation between the two parties. One of the biggest impacts that we can have is say, what are the gaps? Is mental health a gap? We heard that was a gap while some of the teacher contracts were taking place. So we said, all right, well, we will step up to provide clinicians in the schools where kids can have some form of mental health response at the moment in the school itself. They said housing stability. So we provide housing. So often mayors we kind of operate in this petri dish of experimentation where we are trying what hasn't worked. We are trying to fill in what hasn't worked in the past. And the stable homes, stable schools is just one example of that. And to just say one other piece about, we always get stuck in the terminology of defund or refund the police, of should, of what form of safety response should police officers be approaching. I've seen this pendulum swing violently back and forth between defund and abolish on one side and then an occupying force on the other. Those are not the two options. Those are not the two options. You can have an officer that is committed to, lives in, and cares deeply about a community. You can have an officer that helps to enforce the law, which is their job, and we should appreciate and respect them for that. And then you can have somebody else that does mental health response, somebody else that provides social service, and somebody else that provides work with people experiencing homelessness. There are very few things that Mayor Carter and I are really good at. We aren't experts in everything. So you hire people that are. That same approach should be applied to safety 100% of the time. And that's, I think, what we're moving towards right now in the Twin Cities, and hopefully we can set an example that others can also follow.
So, I don't know if you wanted to say something, but I wanted to just have each of you talk about what brings you joy and what's really important personally, but also within because we want to see everyone as human beings, especially on Yom Kippur. So what brings you joy? And if you want to say something about what brings you joy at your position as mayor, you can do that. But what is it about you that is really important? Because that's not always easy to find when you're many times feeling like you're fending off a lot.
Okay. I gain joy from a lot of things. I gain joy from my family. We have a 2.5-year-old who was born in the pandemic, who's just the boss in ways. Little kids take over a household. We've got 3 teenagers, and so I don't know much about gymnastics, but I know that when I'm at a meet and my 14-year-old looks up at me, I'm supposed to go. And that gives me a lot of joy. Cheering like crazy for varsity volleyball games brings me a lot of joy these days, especially when we're playing a team that's not from St. Paul, because I have to cheer for both sides, and it makes my daughters mad. I have lots of good hobbies. I started woodworking after I became the mayor for some reason, and I enjoy that. I unsuccessfully tried to cut off my thumb a couple of years ago.
No.
And they sewed it right back together, so I'll have to try again later. I like to run, although I'm no professional marathoner or anything. But then, socially speaking, anybody like scary movies? I like to watch scary movies. And at the end of every scary movie, towards the end of every scary movie, there's this part where all the heads start spinning and the beds start levitating and the mirrors start crashing off the walls and the lights start blinking and stuff like that. And that's the moment in time when the demons know they're on their run and it's their last stand and they've got nowhere else to hide, and they're trying to make their last stand. And it's right before the kind of break of day. And I think that's the moment we're in American history right now. because we're seeing all this ugliness and we're seeing all this craziness kind of come to the head at the same time. But at the same time, it's creating openings for us to do amazing work, like the work that Mayor Fry was just talking about. It's creating it's creating generational openings for us to try something like guaranteed income in our communities that literally just like 3 years ago would have been insane for us to kind of suggest maybe in our communities. That's gone from, like I said, this fringe idea just a couple of years ago to 100 mayors signed on to this thing right now. And so it just feels like this is one of those moments that Martin Luther King was telling us about when he told us the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I got a chance to spend time with his daughter, Dr. Bernice King, recently, and she was reminding us that it doesn't bend itself. And it gives me a lot of joy to feel like some of the work that we're doing here in Minnesota is helping to bend the arc.
Perfect.
So our daughters are approximately the same age. I think Amila's probably 4 or 5 months older than Frida. In fact, I think Amila was the first little person that Frida met.
Likewise, they were terrified of each other.
They were. It was this looking at each other, not sure, not knowing really what to make of it. And it becomes so cliche to say that having a kid changes your perspective. But everybody before we had it, when Sarah was pregnant, which by the way was in the middle of everything, COVID, murder of George Floyd, Sarah was 7.5 months pregnant. And so to say that we have been through a lot collectively as a society and us as a family over these last couple of years would be a massive understatement. But you think that it's a cliche thing to say and unrealistic about a kid changing your perspective until you have one. And it really does. You look at things from an entirely different vantage point. You consider where they're going to school. You want them to be safe. You want them to be a wild success and have opportunity and make sure that they, in fact, have the ability to live a brilliant life. And then you would hope that other children throughout the city that you're charged with running also have those same opportunities too. It does change your perspective, and it's an extraordinary, enlightening thing. And I think one of the other pieces that really brings me joy is the people in my life, in my congregation, that uplift you when you're going through a rough patch. And God knows we have. My wife, Sarah, has a backbone of steel. I'll tell you, it felt like every other day for about 1.5 years there, our home was getting vandalized. One day it would be, far right, anti-Semitic, swastika type stuff, spray painted up on our window or on our door. The next day it would be, defund and abolish the police or we're coming for you. Neither one feels good, believe me. And it was not a short conversation in deciding whether we, and I say we very intentionally, were going to run for office as mayor again. But it came back to this belief that we have a deep and abiding commitment to the city, that we're not quitters, and that once you start to believe in something that is greater than you, you can start to see the trajectory as to where we're going to go. And what brings me joy right now is, unlike a long period of time right there, not only do you see the light at the end of the tunnel, you can start to see the results of the work itself. And this is work that we've both done. This is work that we're both committed to. And I'll just close with one sappy thing. I also find joy in having a really extraordinary partner. Someone who, in Mayor Carter, that we can bounce things off of, where we can work together, where the Twin Cities aren't divided by a river, but united by it. And I think that is something that benefits not just, our friendship, but the Twin Cities at large.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. So much hope, and we thank you two both for being here, and thank you, Mayor Carter, for coming over to all of us to speak with us. You're inspiring, as you are as well, Rabbi. I called you Rabbi. I called that.
Thank you.
Everyone's a rabbi. Rabbi Carter too. There you go.
Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. So we are going to go into the lobby for some contemplative time so that people can come in and turn around the sanctuary. You can stay where you are, but you're just going to have a lot of people moving things around up here. So thank you. Thank you. All right. Oh, please.